Hello, I'm Julie Kim from University of Arizona. It is glad to present my paper in this conference. The title of my presentation is Dative Object as High Applicative in Spanish Construction with Permitir, in English to permit. For most of the synthetic analysis, the verb permitir is considered as an object control verb such as recomendar, sugerir, and obligar, in English to recommend and suggest and to force. These object control verbs take infinitive embedded verb and its subject, which is big pro, thus co-refer with the indirect object of the metric sentence, as we can see number 1. In examples number 1, the indirect object of the metric sentence me, nos, and te are the antecedents of the infinitive subject, big pro. However, while there exists structural similarity between permitir and other prototype object control verbs like recomendar and sugerir, the verb permitir differs from these verbs regarding clitic climbing and negation, making it behave similar to causative verb hacer, in English to make. Regarding clitic climbing, the object control verbs do not allow clitic climbing from its position next to the embedded verb to the metric sentence, in this case lo in number 2. However, in construction with permitir, the object clitic of the embedded verb can be attached to the verb permitir in the metric sentence, as we can see in 3. Similar to the example in 3, the causative structure with hacer also allow clitic climbing. In 4, the structure with the causative verb hacer admit clitic climbing, which in turn suggests that the behavior of permitir is similar to causative verb hacer regarding clitic climbing. The examples 1 to 4 suggest that a possible explanation for the behavior of permitir is to assume that there are 2 verb types of permitir in the lexicon. Number 1 is object control verb like sugerir and recomendar, and number 2 is a possible causative like behavior as in the construction with hacer. The objectivity of this study is to analyze if permitir can be considered as an object control verb or a causative verb in relation to clitic climbing. The main question we aim to address in this study is that are the synthetic prototypes of permitir that contrast with the traditionally classified object control verb and causative verb. In this study, we proposed an alternative analysis to study the construction of permitir and of the causative verb hacer in relation to clitic climbing based on applicative argument structure. The analysis of the applicative argument has been developed fundamentally in the study of Marant, Pirkkonen, and Guerbo. Guerbo proposed that in Spanish there are 3 different subtypes of applicative in Spanish. As we can see in the table in 11, there exists low applicative and affective applicative and high applicative in Spanish. To analyze the internal structure of Permiti, we are going to use the test that Pirkkonen and Korb proposed to distinguish between the distinct possible position of the applicative. Pirkkonen applies the first three tests to distinguish between high applicative and low applicative in English. The objective of the first and second test is to study whether a structure takes a phrase of a high applicative or not. Modifying a descriptive adjective, we can see when a structure takes a phrase of a high applicative or a voice, but we cannot know which of these two phrases is taken by the structure. Therefore, we can modify an agentive adverb to verify whether the structure has a voice P or not. Therefore, we can use this test to study the type of phrase, which are voice P or applicative phrase, is included in the construction with permitted. Moreover, we will apply the third test of Pirkkonen to study what type of dative argument in construction with permitted is between the high applicative and low applicative. Later, we will study the possibility to have a feature of animate of the dative argument of permitted. Lastly, we will study the internal structure of permitted by comparing with the examples of the double object construction, where the dative is the low applicative, through the fifth and ninth tests that Cuervo proposed. In this way, we may distinguish between the dative in the double object construction in Spanish and dative in construction with permitted. The first test is modification of the descriptive adjective to study whether a structure includes a high applicative phrase or voice phrase. According to Pirkkonen, the high applicative and the causative with dative case can be modified by descriptive adjective. In 12A and B, the dative adjective borracha in English drunk modifies the dative clitic, while the borracha in 12C cannot modify the dative clitic, which is affective applicative. With the modification of the dative adjective, we can study that the causative structure of acer in 12A and the structure of permitted in 12B have either high applicative or voice phrase. However, we cannot know with certainty which phrase is included in each structure. To verify which of two phrases exist in each structure, we can use the second test, the modification by an agentive adverb. Kim 2011 arguments that the high applicative phrase and voice phrase are similar. Both phrases combine with the verbal phrase and introduce an external arguments to small VP. However, the voice phrase has the agentive feature, and while the high applicative phrase does not. Therefore, it introduces one external argument, not agentive argument. As a result, an agentive adjective can show whether a structure includes voice phrase or not. As we can see in example number 13, the agentive adverb a propósito in English on purpose can modify the causal, el director, and also the causing, el actor, while the agentive adverb in 13B modifies only the principal subject, in this case, el director de la obra. As the agentive adverb does not modify actor, el actor, the actor in English, we can consider that the structure of permitted does not take a voice phrase, but take a high applicative phrase. To confirm whether the structure of permitted take high applicative phrase, we can use the third and fourth test proposed by Birkanen. The third test is to determine the semantic relation between dative object and accusative object in the structure. As we have already seen, a low applicative argument presents a possessive relation between a low applicative argument and an accusative object, and receive the interpretation of un individuo posee el object. It means in English, one individual owns the object. On the contrary, a high applicative has a relation between an individual and an event. The fourth test is related to the feature of animate. According to Cuervo, the low applicative argument can have animate and inanimate feature, while the high applicative argument must be dative animate argument. While the dative argument is the low applicative argument, especially when it is interpreted as recipient, it can have animate or inanimate feature in 15A and B. As the low applicative is related to possessive relation, it is possible to combine with the verb tener. If we study the feature of animate of the dative argument in the construction with permitir, these dative arguments should be animate, as we can compare 16A and B. Based on the first four tests, we can infer that the dative in construction with permitir is the head of the high applicative phrase, and it is different from the causae. Therefore, we can consider that the internal structure of the construction with permitir and the causative construction with hacer are different syntactically. In addition, the position of high applicative head requires a specific feature, which is the animate feature. The following step is our argument is to compare the dative in the double object construction with the dative in the construction with permitted to better understand the internal structure of this verb. Cuervo explained that in double object construction, where the dative is low applicative argument, the dative can bind the direct object, but not the other way around. In 17, the dative le binds the reflexive pronoun a sí misma. According to principle A of the binding theory, the example 17 is grammatical because the reflexive pronoun should be binded in its domain. In this case, it is the dative. The binding of the anaphor of the construction with permitting function in the different way. The examples 18A and B are grammatical because the reflexive pronoun a sí mismo can be binded in its domain by big pro. According to Chomsky, the big pro is a pronoun and also an anaphor. Therefore, the distribution of big pro can be explained by principle A and also B of the binding theory. In 18, based on the principles of minimum distance of Rosen-Van-Loon, the dative le and the DP Juan function as the controller or the binder of big pro, and the big pro can be antecedent of the reflexive pronoun. The sixth task to explain the position of the applicative in causative and object control verb construction. The difference between these verbs and the construction with the transitive verb is binding of possessive pronouns. According to the binding theory, the possible co-referentiality of the possessive pronoun su in 19 can be explained by principle B. A possessive pronoun must be free in its domain. In 19a, the possessive pronoun in its domain, as the DP does not have any antecedent that comments it, therefore it is not binded. However, the antecedent in 19b, which is la doctora, is in the position where it can bind the possessive pronoun. Therefore, the sentence is grammatical. Different from 19, the sentence with permitted show a distinct behavior. The examples in 20 are grammatical, even though the dative DP, in this case, todos los trabajadores precedes the DP, sus pagos in 20b. In 20, even the enclitic of the infinitive verb, les, or the DP, todos los trabajadores are co-indexed with the possessive pronouns. They do not have comments to the possessive pronoun. Therefore, the enclitic of the infinitive verb and the DP cannot bind the possessive pronoun. Additionally, they cannot bind the dative argument, me, or the big pro. Therefore, the reflexive pronoun in the two sentences in 20 is free and both sentences are grammatical. The seventh task to differentiate applicative in the transitive sentence is its behavior regarding with crossover. According to Cuervo, in double object construction, when a WH phrase moves crossing over the possessive pronoun, which has the co-indexing, this sentence is grammatical as shown in the 21b comparing to 21a. On the contrary, in the sentence with permitir, the effect of weak crossover does not detect. Different from the dative argument 21, the dative argument le in 22 always is in the position where it comments the direct object. Therefore, the examples in 22 are grammatical. The eighth task is related to the quantifier scope. First, Cuervo explains that there are differences of scope between 23A and 23B. The example 23A has only one interpretation, which is only there is a museum that receives its painting, while there exists two interpretations in B. First one is for each one of the magazine, there is one article, and number two is there is only one article that its magazine carries. In the 23A, the extension quantifier un has a scope over the universal quantifier cada, and therefore the conjunctive reading prevails. On the contrary, 23b has both interpretation, conjunctive, and detransitive interpretation. Cuervo explains that in the double object construction, a universal quantifier in direct object, which is theme, cannot have a scope over an existential quantifier. For this reason, cada in 23a cannot have a scope over un, in English one. In 23b, un is located above cada, therefore she comments cada, or as it occurs in the second interpretation, cada moves by quantifier raising and precedes un, and therefore the indirect object, in this case a cada revista precedes the direct object, un artículo. On the contrary, the quantifier scope in construction with permit is different. According to Bruening, there exists a scope frozen effect in 24. The dative which is located in the higher position always has a wide scope. In the 24, as the dative is higher position than BP, the dative always has a scope over the accusative object, and therefore the examples in 24 cannot have ambiguous interpretation. The last test is related to passivization. Gorber mentions that in the double object construction, the indirect object only can convert into the subject in the passive construction. Different from the double object construction, in the structure with permittir, both direct and indirect object can be transformed into the subject in the possessive construction, as we can see 25. In 26, when the indirect object became the subject of the sentence, it requires a possessive construction, and when the direct object became the subject, the DP, which contains the direct object, became the DP with nominative case. Based on this synthetic test that we have seen, we can consider that the dative argument in the construction of permittir is different from the dative argument, which is the low applicative in double object construction. Especially the binding of the anapher and possessive pronoun, the weak crossover, and the quantifier scope, and the passivization show us that dative argument with permittir is in the upper position than the dative in the double object construction. Therefore, we can consider that the dative argument with permittir is the high applicative argument. Based on this hypothesis about this synthetic internal structure of the infinitive complements of the verb permittir, where the embedded argument occupies the position of the characteristic of high applicative. In this study, we studied the synthetic properties of Spanish verb permitir to understand why permitir behaves in the distinct way from other object control verbs, as well as causative verb hacer regarding clearly climbing. To analyze the internal structure of permittir, this study accepted the theory of the applicative argument proposed by Marantz, Pirkkonen, and Cuervo, and others. In Spanish, there exist three distinct applicative arguments regarding their position: high applicative, low applicative, and affective applicative. After applying the 9 tests that Pirkkonen and Cuervo proposed, to analyze the properties of dative, this study proposed that the dative in the structure with permittir is the head of the high applicative phrase. Future work will study clearly climbing in construction with permittir under this hypothesis. Moreover, we will analyze the negation concord in construction with permittir by comparing with the causative verb hacer and other object control verbs. Thank you so much for listening my presentation. Gracias.